Hello, everybody. I wanted to come in today for the final little part of the civil rights series of videos that I have recently been doing here on the channel. I wanted to go ahead and get our final part of the series done today. That way, this is done and it's complete and can be out there. And at the same time, just that way we can finally also wrap things up on this and hopefully be able to move with further topic videos that are to come here at the coming 4th of July holiday. So I'm not going to really waste too much time here at the very beginning introducing things. We'll worry about that at the very end, so I suppose we shall get right into it. And of course, we will be having images again, and we will have our little handy-dandy little history notebook of wisdom, however you want to call it. So let's just get right into this topic. Again, I'm going to start here with a brief little end review of what we covered in the last video on Jim Crow laws and segregation. And this is more toward just a very brief review of what happened there. And that's basically, as we talked in the last video, following the end of Reconstruction in 1877 with the withdrawal of federal troops, most of the southern states passed segregation or Jim Crow laws, which segregated blacks and whites in the South from meeting in public places, from going to restaurants, theaters, a bunch of other things, transportation, almost everything. The Supreme Court basically made this legal with the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896, that as long as they were separate but equal, it was okay. The laws continued throughout during the first half of the 20th century. African Americans were commonly paid less at any job that they tried to get to. They were denied the right to vote in the southern states especially, and commonly faced violent acts such as lynchings and terrorist groups such as the KKK. And of course, we kind of hit that prior to World War II, many blacks had low-paying jobs such as low-wage farmers, factory workers, domestic servants. This was before World War II. The Great Depression hits after the stock market crashes in 1929, and of course, these workers, the African Americans, tend to be the first ones to get hit due to their lower-paying jobs. They're the first ones to be let go, so they're especially hard hit during the Great Depression. When the U.S. enters World War II in the 1940, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the jobs in the country, of course, skyrocket in the nation due to the war. And most blacks, of course, do not benefit from these jobs because of the continued discrimination and racism in the country, especially in the South where most of them live, which causes many of them to continue to have these low-paying jobs even though these new ones have occurred. And that is basically our little review, and this is where we're going to get to the new. During the spring of 1941, may I add, during World War II, that thousands of African Americans actually threatened to march on Washington, D.C. to demand equal employment rights, to try to change this. Due to the war breaking out, there's tons of higher-paying jobs. They're being denied them due to their race, and they threaten to march on the Capitol unless something is done. In response to this, President Franklin Roosevelt basically issues Executive Order 8802 on June 25th of 1941. Keep in mind, Pearl Harbor did not happen until December of that year. The order opened all national defense jobs and government jobs to any Americans, regardless of their race, color, or national ethnicity origin. During World War II, as we stated in the previous video, many black men and women, both alike, did serve in the armed forces, did help out with the war effort. Either they served in the front lines or they served in the factories as factory workers, just like many other people did. And however, many of the black soldiers, as we also had mentioned in the previous video, upon returning home from the front lines, they continued to suffer racial discrimination and segregation despite them being heroes. Now, one very distinguished group during World War II of African American military men was the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II, which I think most of us might have learned about them. It became the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps, which at the time there was no Air Force. It was called the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was not until after World War II that officially the Air Force got named and separated from the Army. So during World War II, there was no Air Force. It was simply the Army Air Corps. However, so basically we can say Air Force nowadays, and they earned over 150 flying crosses for their service. They were very accomplished combat pilots. Upon returning home, as we mentioned, many of the black veterans did face prejudice and scorn. And this is where we're going to start, I suppose, with a brief little thing after World War II, because I kind of stopped. This is still kind of a review, I suppose, this last little thing, and I did mention in the previous video that in 1948, President Harry Truman officially kind of took the first stand against segregation by issuing Executive Order 9981, which officially ended racial segregation within the U.S. military. And before this, African American units were usually kept separated and were not integrated with white units. And now, with Truman's order, that is no longer legal, and they must be integrated in the U.S. military. So that kind of covers the prelude. Now let's get into the civil rights movement, what the topic of our video here is about. The civil rights movement in earnest, I suppose, you could consider it beginning on December 1st of 1955. And this is the date when an African-American woman, who we commonly know today, I'm sure you know her name, Rosa Parks. If you do not know that name, I don't know where you have been in school. And Rosa Parks, as we probably have all heard the story, was arrested on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, which is the capital of the state of Alabama. She was, of course, coming home from work on one of the buses that day. She initially complied with local segregation laws. As we had mentioned, they were segregated in almost everything, and this included buses. Local segregation laws required that black people were to sit in the back of the bus, and white passengers were to sit in the front of the bus. So black passengers in the back, white in the front. And then they were allowed to somewhat intermingle in the middle. Well, Parks initially obeyed this. She went along with the law. Well, eventually, a white man tried to get on board, as I'm sure we've all been told. As he tried to get on board, there was no seats left. The driver tried to, demanded or ordered Parks and 3 other black passengers to give up their seats, and Parks refused to give up hers, and in turn, the police were called, and she was arrested. Parks was sent, and she was arrested by the police. News of Parks' arrest spread fast throughout the city. It spread fast throughout the nation, and it really sparked a renewed outrage against segregation. It sparked the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, so much to the fact that many people today now call Rosa Parks the mother of the civil rights movement. And in case you do not know who Rosa Parks is, what happened, which I find that hard to believe if you've lived here in the United States and gone through the public education system. I find that very hard to believe you've never seen a photo of her or never heard of her, for that matter. But this is a picture of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted by the deputy sheriff at the police station after her arrest. Again, Rosa Parks. If you do not know her, I don't know where you've been, and you live in the United States at least, I don't know where you have been for your entire existence. So as we mentioned, this causes outrage. There's already been, as we mentioned, in the years prior, there had been small bouts of opposition to the segregation laws in the South. But with Parks' arrest, something really just finally clicks into many African Americans, and they really finally start just going after segregation full-heartedly once and for all. They're sick of it now. It's just kind of out of hand. And in Montgomery, where Parks had been arrested, the black community leaders created what we call the Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIAA, or MIAA. I will say MIAA. And this was led by another very famous African-American civil rights leader, who I'm sure we all know, and has a holiday named after him in January, and that is none other than the local Montgomery Baptist minister known as Martin Luther King Jr. If you do not know who he is, you've been living in a hole. You've been living in a hole. So much to the fact I don't think I should have to show a photo of him. because I think you probably know who he is. At least you should know who he is. And in case you don't know, at the end of this video, I will provide a little link to a video that showcases his most famous speech of all, the I Have a Dream speech. Just so that you can listen to that in its entirety, in case you have not ever heard of it in its entirety, or you just want to hear it for yourself. We will get to that later. Now, anyway, the MIAA, which is led by Dr. King, they support Parks by staging a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Basically, in this boycott, black African Americans were not going to ride the buses. Now, you might think, well, how's that going to kill them? They're going to get money still from the white passengers. Yes, but remember, buses are still getting African American passengers. If they're not riding, they're only making half their money. It's still hurting them financially. And this boycott goes on for 381 days, over a year, until finally the buses cave in. The bus systems in Montgomery finally cave in, and they give in to the protesters' boycott. This ends shortly after basically after the Supreme Court had officially issued that segregated seating was unconstitutional in November of 1956. So roughly within a year, it was over, and the Supreme Court had ruled that you cannot be segregating seats. That's not right. For once, the Supreme Court's on the right side of history, where in Plessy versus Ferguson, they had kind of said that segregation was fine and legal. Now they're saying, no, it's illegal and unconstitutional. Make up your mind, Supreme Court. We could have used this help many years prior. Okay, so right now, let's go to the schools, which I suppose is the next major thing that occurs with this budding civil rights movement. In 1954, roughly a year before Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery in the bus boycott began, there was another issue that came up in the civil rights, and this was the very definitive Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. And in this historic Supreme Court case in 1954, the Supreme Court came out and ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and that thus it was made illegal, and that schools must be integrated immediately. They must be desegregated. Now, many Southern schools had no choice, were given no choice but to comply to this. You are going to comply with this as a national law. However, many white students ended up being pulled out of schools by their parents. Their parents didn't want them going with black African American students. They thought, oh no, my child's not going with them. My child's not going. They're not going to go. They're not going to go to school with no African American. Of course, they use another word, but I'm not saying that word. I will not say that word. Anyway, they would take their students out of school, and this was some schools. Now, other schools, with encouragement by the state governments and their governors, purposely refused to integrate their classes because the governors indicated that they would stand against the Supreme Court decision. Well, this was a bad decision because the federal government was more than willing to intervene, and this is exactly what happened in the case of the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, or Arkansas. I don't know how they say it. No offense, I'm going to call it Arkansas. If it's not called that, I apologize. However, so what happens is, in the Little Rock 9 incident, there was 9 African American students who, on September 3rd of 1957, the 9 African American students tried to make their way to their new school that is trying to be desegregated of, let me see here, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is the capital of Arkansas, or Arkansas. And this is to begin their classes as a newly desegregated high school. However, when they arrive there, the 9 students, who become known as the Little Rock Nine, they are confronted by the Arkansas National Guard, who has been ordered there by Arkansas's Governor Orville Faubus. I don't know if I'm saying that last name right. And they also face a large violent mob. So as soon as they get to school, they can't even get through the doors because the state National Guard is there to block them, and so is a large, angry mob of protesters. The students tried again to get the entrance to the school a couple weeks later. This time they actually succeeded in getting inside the school. However, they were soon removed for their own safety when the mob outside started turning quite violent. Due to this, the African American students can't enter their school, and they're supposed to be legally attending this school. They're supposed to legally, under constitutional law, supposed to be attending this school, and the state is trying to basically prevent it. Well, this actually forces the President of the United States' hand, and the President of the United States at that time is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower had been the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. So that, if you've ever heard of him, that might be where you've heard of him before. And he was elected president in 1950, I think here, I think, and he took office in 1953. He served 2 terms. He was the president before John F. Kennedy. And President Eisenhower, he intervenes on behalf of the African-American students, the Little Rock Nine. And what he does something that's kind of odd that this should even have to happen, but it did. And he actually sends federal soldiers, federal troops, to escort these students to the school and to be with them when they are going to and from their classes at the high school. Basically, you have soldiers as your bodyguards almost all day. Yes, it ensured that now the students did get into the school. They were finally let into the school, and it kind of ended the situation. But it was kind of sad that segregation was so impounded in the South, so enrooted, that the people were willing to try to block anything they could to stop this. So bad that it actually took that the President of the United States had to send federal troops to ensure that 9 students got into a school, just because their color of their skin was different. That's a little bit ridiculous that it came to that, but it did. In case we want to see some photos, I'm trying to do them as we go. Let me see here. No. And, that may look here. This is a picture of the Little Rock Nine. Well, a member of the Little Rock Nine. It's not all of them. And as you can see, she's trying to enter the high school. And as she's walking up to go to school, you can see that the white students around her some are just giving her the awful glare, like these 2, especially this one. And some are turning kind of violent and just shouting and screaming at them like the very obvious nasty-mouthed woman behind her, who are just not very happy that, oh, there's an African-American in our school. I don't like you. You're a different color. Did I ever tell you white people that I don't like you because you are a different color? Just because you're white doesn't mean you're pure. Because trust me, I want to make this statement. White people, to the white supremacists that think that white people are superior to African Americans, be aware. I have met plenty of white people that I would collectively term as white trash because they are ridiculously stupid. That's not all, and it's not a majority, but there's a large number of them that think they're better than anyone else. They think that they're white supremacists. Some of them are white supremacists, not every one of them, but they just think they're superior to everyone else. And they're really not. They really aren't. And these people, the white supremacists, I just want to make this clear. I have met many African American people in my life. I've met students of mine, well, not students of mine, but friends of mine that I've had over the past. They were African American. They were some of the nicest people I've ever known. There's one very particular that I remember very distinctly, and he was although he had his weird habits, but that was because he was a fellow kid like all of us. He was just a kid. He had some weird habits that any kid had, but he was no different than the rest of us. He acted just like the rest of us. In some ways, he was a very funny guy, and I didn't always I wasn't very talkative, always around other people, and I didn't really talk to him as much as I should have, but I was friendly whenever he wanted to talk or stuff like that, and he was a good guy. And my point being that I have met many African American students, I've met many African American people that are just fine. They're some of the best people I've ever met. And then I meet some white people, and they are some of the nastiest, most stuck up, stupid, idiotic, full of upright crap. We'll say that. And it just makes me amazed that white supremacists think that whites are so much better when honestly, I've met I've met white people that are much worse than anything they possibly tried to say that African Americans are. No one is innocent, but no one is better. Make that clear. No race is better than another. We're all different skin colors, but we're all human beings. And another kind of issue I'm just going to hit here, and that's this. And it wasn't just Arkansas that had problems with schools wanting to when I say the desegregation of schools, this also meant college universities as well. And Arkansas was not the only state that had this problem. And in fact, Alabama had a very big problem with this. And their governor was a very nasty segregationist man named George Wallace. George Wallace was a very firebrand how would I put this? Firebrand segregationist. In his campaign slogan, he said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was very for segregation, and he tried to oppose the federal government's desegregation measures in any way that he could. And in one instance, when black African American students were trying to gain entry into the University of Alabama in order to enroll for their classes, Governor Wallace actually went with Alabama National Guard troops and blocked the door to the university. So much in fact that the U.S. government actually had to get an order from President Kennedy that said, okay, either step aside or we will move you. Now, Wallace later actually went on to supposedly become a reborn-again Christian. He claimed that he was not a segregationist anymore and that he deeply apologized for his actions during the civil rights era, but I honestly have my doubts over what he did, because he seemed like a very racist man. And this is a picture of him and some of the Alabama National Guard members blocking the entrance to the doors of the Alabama State University. Governor Wallace is the one right here in this suit, just standing a little tall. So be aware, it was throughout the South. It wasn't just Arkansas, it was other states. Alabama had it too. Alabama actually had a lot of the civil rights stuff, or a lot of it got violent in Alabama. Alabama's like a standout. So that covers kind of the schools here. So now we get to the Act of 1957. And basically, although Americans had gained their rights to vote, most southern and some northern states, as we have stated, were constantly trying to make the process of voting very difficult for African Americans, if not impossible, trying to block them from voting in elections. And many African American voters were required to take literacy tests, and these were both confusing and misleading. They weren't always the best. And that wasn't the only thing. They had other things, such as something that the southern states like to call the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause, it kind of determined, I guess, how you could vote, determined on the status of your grandfather. And in most African Americans' case back in the day, their grandfather had been an enslaved person, because slavery had not been ended until 1865. And in some form or another, they tried to use that as an excuse, saying, well, you're not eligible to vote. Yeah, we are. Have you read the 15th Amendment? Now, of course, this doesn't go over well, and because of this, most didn't pass the literacy test, most didn't pass the eligibility tests, and they were denied their right to vote in most southern communities and states in the elections. Now, President Eisenhower's administration wanted to kind of be seen as a pro-civil rights administration. He wanted to be seen that he was taking a side with civil rights activists. And he pressures Congress for new civil rights legislation. Keep in mind, there's really been no civil rights legislation even proposed in Congress since Reconstruction back in the 19th century, back post the Civil War. And this actually happens. And on September 9th of 1957, President Eisenhower signed what is known as the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law. And what does this act do? Well, this act is really the first major civil rights act to be passed since Reconstruction. And what it does is it allows for federal prosecution of anybody who attempts to prevent someone from voting and even creates a voter fraud commission. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a first step toward addressing a problem. Because many southern states still ignore this. Now, as the 1960s dawns, there is a new era to the civil rights movement that begins. And this begins quite rapidly with two very famous chapters, collectively what we want to call here as the lunch counters and the freedom riders. We will discuss the lunch counters first. Lunch counters are a new form of protest that start occurring starting on February 1st of 1960. And what happens is in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 black college students, they actually challenge segregation by going to a lunch counter in the city, and they sit in at a Woolworth's lunch counter, I guess is what it was called, in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they refuse to leave without being served. Due to segregation and some restaurants being committed, not all restaurants, I should put this, some restaurants were segregated, others were simply, they were whites-only restaurants. They would not serve African Americans. And this lunch counter would not serve African Americans. So these black students went in there, and they refused to leave that counter until they were served. These students gained attention nationwide because of their actions, and they actually gained support from hundreds of people and who actually joined in with them and what they collectively become known as the Greensboro sit-ins. However, the police kind of get involved, and a few of the protesters end up being arrested, and they are charged with trespassing. Oh yeah, you're trespassing on white-only property. I'm sorry, but the Constitution says no, there is no white-only property. Eventually, what happens is the protesters, in response to this, they boycott all of the segregated lunch counters in Greensboro. Kind of like they had done in Montgomery with the buses after Rosa Parks' arrest. And this has basically the same outcome, and that's the fact that the lunch counters eventually cave in due to many other things. And they actually cave in and allow the African Americans to come and eat, including the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro actually allows the 4 college students, the 4 black college students, to actually come and eat at that counter after when it's done. So, and what happens, it's kind of also spawns students, college students, young African-American students are spawned to kind of really get involved in the civil rights movement. And what happens is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, as we might want to call it, they start to encourage students to really get involved for the first time in the movement. And many young college students actually join, including a very famous one that we will recognize here, and that is Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael joined in what is become known as Freedom Summer in 1964. And Freedom Summer was basically protests to help register black voters in Mississippi. In 1966, Carmichael, he became the chair of the SNCC, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he actually gives a very famous speech in which he terms the phrase Black Power. Now, the other big event that happens during the early 1960s with the civil rights movement is collectively known as the Freedom Riders. And this happens when, following the Supreme Court rules in the 1960 case of Boynton versus Virginia that the segregation of interstate transportation facilities is unconstitutional. And what happens is on May 4th of 1961, several people, 7 blacks and 6 whites, get on board a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C., and they embark on this bus tour of the deep South states, and in order to protest the still segregated terminals, even though the Supreme Court had ruled so, the terminals are still being segregated. And these riders on this bus become known as the Freedom Riders. Do excuse me. And they gain both national and international attention for their rides. Unfortunately, they don't go so well over once they get down south, because the white supremacist racists down there are very angry. Because keep in mind, as the African Americans amp up the civil rights movement, many segregationists and racists are become more violent and more kind of prone to just attack African Americans, because they're seeing that this is not going to stop, that you're going to get your way, and we don't want you to get your way. And the Freedom Riders face violence from police officers and from mobs. And what happens is on Mother's Day of 1961, a mob actually attacks the bus in Anniston, Alabama, and they throw a bomb inside the bus, and this blows up. The bus is caught on fire. The bus is gone, basically. And the riders actually escape the bus, but many of them are then subsequently beaten severely by this mob of protesters. The news of this bombing spreads very fast, and U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who is the brother of President John F. Kennedy, he actually negotiates a deal with the Alabama governor, John Patterson, to get a new driver for the riders. So this happens after George Wallace leaves office. And on May 20th, they start off on once again on another bus, but this time they have a police escort. So they continue their ride through the South. And in Montgomery, when the bus gets to Montgomery, Alabama, the police leave the bus. And this leads to them being attacked by another white mob in Montgomery, and Kennedy actually has to send federal marshals into the city to ensure their safety. On May 24th, there were other groups of Freedom Riders that start breaking out elsewhere. They starting out at separate points of going south as well. On May 24th, another group of Freedom Riders, they reach Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of the state. And they are met by support from supporters, but they also get arrested for trespassing whites-only facilities, and they are also placed in jail for 30 days. Many of them are incarcerated in the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Now, this does not go over well with many civil rights activists in their groups, and the NAACP, also known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, actually sends attorneys to bring a lawsuit issue to the Supreme Court. This issue gets raised to the Supreme Court, the arrest of these Freedom Riders, and the Supreme Court reverses the convictions that sent them to jail for 30 days. And it causes hundreds of new Freedom Riders to then join in and continue the rides. In the fall of 1961, President John F. Kennedy's administration, they successfully pressure the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was responsible for the segregated bus terminals and all that. They finally convince them to issue new regulations that prohibit segregation at these terminals. So I'm going to show a couple photos again. We have a photo of 3 African American students at one of the lunch counters during the Greensboro sit-ins. They would sit there and would not leave until they were served. Or in some cases, they'd stay there all day, and they stay there until closed, leave, and come back the next day until closed, until they eventually would get served. Here, we have another one where I mentioned that mobs would attack these Freedom Riders. Well, we have a photo of, I don't remember where this one was at, but this is a photo of a white mob actually attacking some of the Freedom Riders in one of the bus terminal stations. Why they thought they had to do this, why they couldn't just live with segregation as being a bad thing, I have no idea. I'm not stupid, white people. I'm a white person, but I'm not a stupid white person. Now, what becomes the most famous event of the entire civil rights movement, and I'm sure the one that we all know, occurs on August 28th of 1963. And this is what we know as the March on Washington. This most famous event is basically in response to a statement by President Kennedy that he is going to introduce a proposal to Congress to craft a new civil rights legislation that is more significant than ever before. And this happens in June of that year. And the whole march is held in the hopes of raising support for the bill in Congress. And Kennedy at first was walking a fine line over whether or not to give African Americans the civil rights bill or not, but he was eventually turned after seeing a uptake and spike in racial violence in the South, especially in Alabama, where he had seen photos of the police turning police dogs on high school students and turning full force fire hoses on them. No, I am not lying. I have the photos to show you. In Alabama, racial tensions got so high between African Americans and white segregationists that in an effort to break up these things, some of the police turned the German Shepherd police dogs on the students, as we can see here. And in probably one of the most shocking views I've seen, the firefighters even turned on full force fire hoses and were spraying the students. I mean, you say, oh, it's a hose. Well, it's a fire hose. Do you know how much pressure is in a fire hose? It ain't pretty. It's enough to pin you to the ground. That's how much pressure is in a fire hose. Of course, President Kennedy announces in response to this, he's finally had enough. And he's saying that, okay, you're going to do this. We need civil rights because this is ridiculous. And the march is basically planned in the hope that it will kind of raise support for that bill in Congress. The march is led by multiple members of the civil rights movement, many of its leaders, and among these include Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and of course, our most famous guy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who all hope to basically kind of raise awareness for the condition of African Americans. At this march in Washington, D.C., there were fears that if they had this, it was going to be racial violence in the Capitol. However, this never actually happens. However, over 200,000 people show up in Washington, D.C. It's actually one of the largest protests, if not the largest protest ever held in the nation's capital. And it isn't just African Americans. There are plenty of whites in the crowd as well that have joined in with them. And at the rally, they join together around the Washington Monument. They all kind of gather around that, and then they walk and march all the way from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the National Mall, the reflecting pool in front of it. And they start kind of giving speeches on the issues that are plaguing them, over why you need to support this bill, why we need civil rights, and all that. And many of the leaders, they speak in front of the Lincoln Memorial before Dr. King finally comes up with his speech. Dr. King would be the last. No one wanted to be the last one to speak that day, so Dr. King volunteered that he would just go ahead and he would speak last because he didn't think he was going to speak real long. And halfway through his prepared speech, he kind of pauses a little bit and he starts listing his very famous part now where he starts proclaiming of his own very personal dream he has of racial justice and equality for everyone in the United States, and how it will one day happen. And this becomes known as his now very famous I Have a Dream speech, in which he professes that one day, no matter what race you are, you will be able to hold hands and live together with other people in this country. And we will not judge each other, and I quote by him, from his children. That he listed that one day he hoped that his children would not have to live in a world like that now, basically, that they would one day be judged not, and I'm quoting him right here now, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I think that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. he's a very wise man. He was a very wise man. He was a very influential man. And the words that he speaks there, I think they're very significant even today, because of the fact that we are too quick to judge people just based on their nationality, just based on their ethnicity, just based on their religion, and we really don't give it much second thought. Like a common one today is Muslims. Here in the United States, there are a lot of people who don't trust Islamic origin peoples, and this partly because of 9/11 and a lot of other things, but we cannot judge them due to that. Dr. King's words saying that judge them not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, basically saying don't judge a person before you even know them. Don't judge them just because they're a different skin color than you. Don't judge them just because they're a different religion than you. Judge them by getting to know them, know what their personality is, know what their character is, then judge them. Are they a good person or not? Don't judge automatically without even really knowing them just because they're a different race or a religion. Judge them by knowing them. That is a very common thing that has been said throughout history, but he said it very well there, and it needs to be done even today. It's kind of sad that it's not. Halfway through, as we said, that's when it came. Months later, in November, unfortunately, President Kennedy ends up being shot and assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald on November 22nd of 1963. And however, his proposed civil rights bill does actually pass Congress. It does go through. And it is officially adopted. And this is partially attributed to not only Kennedy's death, where the nation felt they needed to give him proper legacy, but to the March on Washington as well. In case you want to see a picture of the March on Washington, this is a photograph from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial of just roughly how many thousands of people you had attending this march. Yeah, a lot. A lot. And there's whites and blacks. On July 2nd of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was President Kennedy's vice president and becomes president upon Kennedy's assassination, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he signs it into law under the witness of many civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And what this law does is it guarantees equal employment for everybody, no matter of your race, no matter of your sex, no matter of your whatever else, your religion. It basically starts limiting the literacy tests that many southern states require for voting to try to limit these. It does not abolish them, but it does limit the tests. And it does allow federal authorities to ensure that public facilities are being properly integrated with each other, that segregation is being properly ended in public facilities. So it really ends segregation right there and then. The Jim Crow is done. It's over. And the movement kind of continues still, though. And it still has a couple violent episodes, and one of these comes on March 7th of 1965 on the march of African American protesters from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. And during this march, as they're exiting Selma and they are nearing what is named the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they end up being blocked by Alabama state and local police. And they've been sent there by, of course, that back in power segregationist governor, George Wallace. And the protesters refuse to stand down and they start marching toward the police anyway. And in return, the police tear gas the protesters, and then many of them end up being brutally beaten by the police. And this incident becomes known as Bloody Sunday, as it happened on a Sunday. And it causes many of the activists of the civil rights movement to kind of split and divide. Some, such as the very famous one that I'm sure you also have heard of, and that is Malcolm X, kind of advocate that we need to have a violent retaliation for this, while others, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., kind of continue to stress the importance of holding nonviolent protests and peaceful nature. And this I want to list that. That both Malcolm X and Dr. King were very influential civil rights people. However, Malcolm X was more prone to violence and more retaliatory things than Dr. King was. Dr. King was more about a peaceful protest, where Malcolm X was not afraid to say that we need to go out there with weapons. We need to go out there and make them pay. We need to go out there and make sure that the African American is rising up, even by force if he has to. This was really where the two kind of diverged from each other. They were on the same side. They were still both in the civil rights movement, but they differed on their views over how to get it done. On August 6th of 1965, a further step is kind of taken, and President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965 on August 6th of that year. And he signs it into law, and this expands the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This does not deal with segregation, but with voting. Voting is still a problem, as we mentioned that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 only limited the literacy tests. It did not abolish them. Another thing I want to add was there would be a poll tax that many people would have to pay in the South to vote, but this mostly only occurred with African Americans, and since many African Americans already had low-wage jobs and low incomes, many of them could not afford to pay the poll tax. Thus, they could not vote. And this new law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, actually eliminates the poll tax. It eliminates many of the mechanisms that the southern states have been using to try to bar the African American population from voting. It eliminates the poll taxes, it eliminates the literacy tests, and it eliminates the grandfather clause. It makes all of these illegal. They're done. African Americans finally can vote without any obstruction. And to even enforce it for once, the act even authorizes that the federal government is to oversee elections in areas and states that have had a history of voter suppression. Any state that had had a history of putting a poll tax, any state that had had a history of the grandfather clause, any state that had had a history of the literacy tests, will have federal authorities overseeing any election that occurs for a while just to ensure that they're not doing it. So that's the major difference there between the voting that we gave them with the 15th Amendment in Reconstruction, but it really wasn't enforced as the Reconstruction era governments died off. Where in this act, we are reaffirming that they have that right, and we're actually enforcing it. Now, 1965 unfortunately also sees the death of a civil rights leader, Malcolm X, who gets assassinated at one of his rallies. And that is on February 21st. And to make things even worse, sad, after the Voting Rights Act, most of the civil rights movement is done by this point. They've accomplished most of its goals, but there's still one major thing they want to tackle, and many civil rights activists start tackling the problem of housing. There's still segregation and discrimination kind of going on in housing, like hotels or new homes, apartments, and they want to combat this as well. And for the 1966, 1967, and 1968, many of the civil rights leaders are actively protesting this and trying to gain attention that another law needs to be passed to try to end this. And unfortunately, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting this. He was scheduled to actually stand aside some sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, at a different rally for a different subject, I think. And he was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was in a hotel on the morning of April 6, 1968. I do apologize. April 6, 1968. Oh, I got that wrong. The date's wrong. April 4th. I want to clarify. April 4th, 1968. On that morning, Dr. King is coming out of his hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, to get ready to go to this meeting with the sanitation workers, and while he is on the balcony of his hotel, he is shot and killed by an assassin who is determined to be an individual known as James Earl Ray. And due to Dr. King's death, he's kind of seen as the big leader of the civil rights movement, and his death really sparks outrage across the nation, and there is riots and there's looting everywhere, as people are just beyond ticked. And in response to this, new pressure gets put on the administration of President Johnson. And in response to this, he passes a new set of civil rights laws. The final set of the civil rights movement gets passed on April 11th. Just days after King's death, President Johnson passes his final piece, signs into law his final piece of civil rights legislation known as the Fair Housing Act. And what the Fair Housing Act does is it acts as the final piece of civil rights legislation that gets passed, and what it does is it prevents housing discrimination based on a person's race, on their sex, on national origin, or their religion. You cannot discriminate giving someone an apartment just due to them being another race, due to them being a girl or a guy, due to them being Turkish, Chinese, English, and you cannot do it because they're Islamic or Christian or Jewish or whatever. So basically, that is the end of the civil rights movement. And now, in the end, it did accomplish most of its goals that it set out to do. The civil rights movement did officially end the big problem of segregation. Well, now, white supremacy is no longer in power in the South. For once, it is finally out of power. However, it still is lingering as it still is there today. White supremacy is still very much in this nation. It's angry not only at African Americans, but at everybody else because it was forced from power when segregation was ended in 1964. It's like been a wolf, a small silent predator, just waiting in the dark, waiting for it to be able to come out and just kind of reemerge. And it does at times. It did end the segregation. It ended voter suppression, discrimination in employment and housing. And another added topic here, it did allow legalization of interracial marriages. During segregation in the South, African Americans and whites were forbidden, basically, to be able to marry each other. They were not allowed to date each other. Nothing. Even if they loved each other, they couldn't. It was seen as wrong. And you weren't allowed to marry another person outside of your race. Well, during the civil rights movement, a law gets passed and the Supreme Court intervenes as well and basically says that interracial marriages are constitutional. They are allowed. So that basically wraps up the civil rights movement. I do have one little photo here I forgot to kind of show. This is a picture of President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which really covered most of the civil rights legislation and really ended on most of it, except for the expansion that he would do with the Voting Rights Act. But this is the major piece of civil rights legislation, and as you can see, President Johnson is down here, and he's being observed by several civil rights leaders, including, right behind him, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is in 1964. That covers the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, and it also concludes our small little series here on the civil rights little series. I understand that the protests are still going on in this nation, and I can have no power over that. I do sympathize with those who feel that there is an injustice going on in this country. I do heavily sympathize with you, but I also plead with you, violence is not the answer. Violence will only lead to more violence. Don't go violent. Don't do it. Because even the Constitution itself, if I quote the First Amendment, you have the right to peacefully assemble. Peacefully assemble. Peacefully is the key word, not violence. I just simply ask that you exercise caution, and I simply ask that if you do take part in these protests, that you exercise that simple peaceful part. Violence gets us nowhere but more. You don't return. It's like the Bible as well. Just because if you get slapped once, you're not supposed to go and slap the other person like this. You're not supposed to do that. As the Bible says, if you get slapped on the cheek, you turn your head and you get the other one slapped. You don't do it back. It's just, it don't solve problems. It creates more. That's all I can really emphasize. So that, I hope I did somewhat of a thing here with this series, trying to emphasize the history of the injustice that has been done in the past to African Americans in this country, from slavery to Reconstruction to segregation to even up to the Civil Rights Movement. It has really been a dark and lonely path that they've had to trod, and it's really one they shouldn't have had to trod, but they have. And I do feel sorry that they have had to do so. And I feel very sorry that there's still parts of this country that still can't seem to learn those lessons. I just don't know what else I can really do with that problem. So that basically concludes it here at this series. As for what we're planning now, with the 4th of July holiday coming up, it is about time for the start of our series on the American Revolution. I will be starting that next week. I may try to squeeze the War of 1812 video in next week, but I may just judge to deal that after the 4th of July. Just wait till after that, just not to try to have to rush anything. But we will be starting the American Revolution series next week with the war that happened that really brought about the entire possible of the American Revolution, and that was the French and Indian War between Britain and France over their colonial possessions in the late 1750s and early 1760s. So we will hit that as our first of those videos. But that is our plan as of right now. If you liked this series, or if you have any comments or recommendations over what I could have done better, what I could have mentioned, anything I left out, or what you thought, be sure to leave that in the comment section below on this video or any of the videos as part of the series. I ask that if you did like this series, be sure to let me know by liking the video or disliking it if you want to. If you like the content that has been coming out on the channel, do be sure to subscribe. If you're constantly coming back and you're looking at the channel or something like that, I do heavily suggest that you do that, because there's going to constantly be more. Again, any topics you may have, as always, feel free to get them to me. So I think that about wraps it up for this particular video. So hopefully everyone continues to have a good rest of their weekend. Summer is officially here as of today. And we hopefully will see you all back here next week. If not with the War of 1812, then when the American Revolution starts. So have a great rest of your weekend, and God bless you.